She closed her eyes, expecting death. Instead, she woke in a stranger's bed, left for dead in a Colorado dust storm. Tyann, an Apache woman with nowhere left to run, found herself at the edge of survival. But what happens when the person who saves you speaks fewer words than the wind, and carries grief heavier than his rifle Elias Boone? Once a lawman, now a silent rancher hiding from his own past. Doesn't ask questions. He doesn't demand thanks. He simply offers warmth, food, and silence. Could you trust a man who says nothing, but shows everything? As Tyann learns to walk again, then to stay, this story becomes less about survival and more about healing. About the way broken things don't always need fixing. Sometimes they just need a place to rest. What would you do if you had the chance to begin again, not with promises, but with presence? This is a quiet story, but quiet doesn't mean empty. Stay with us, let it unfold. And if this story touches something in you, leave us a comment, subscribe, or share it with someone who still believes in second chances. Now, let us take you back to where it all began. She closed her eyes, waiting for death to come. The last thing she felt was the bite of wind, and then nothing. When she woke, the bed was warm, but the warmth wasn't comforting, not at first. To Tyann, it felt like betrayal. Her body, wrapped in borrowed heat, pulsed with ache. The blanket over her chest was thick and unfamiliar, and her ribs throbbed in a slow, deep rhythm, bruises blooming like hidden ink beneath her skin. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she was dreaming or dead. The fire crackled nearby. Shadows moved gently across wooden walls, flickering in quiet patterns. There was a scent, cedarwood smoke and broth long simmered. A chair creaked. Someone breathed. Panic struck her chest before her eyes could fully open. Tyann's last memory had been the storm. Wind that screamed through the canyon like 1,000 angry spirits. Her limbs had frozen one by one. Her breath had caught in her throat like glass. She had curled into the red dirt, let her eyes close, and whispered her ancestors' names into the dark. She hadn't planned to wake again, but now she had, and she didn't know where she was. She turned her head slightly. Pain needled through her temple. The ceiling above was wooden, roughly hewn, with old nails rusting into the beams. Dust hovered in the air, catching golden light from the stove. Not a tent, not the dirt floor of a prison camp, not the open sky. Her heartbeat sped. Beneath the blanket, her hands moved slowly, searching. No ropes, no shackles, just cloth soft, well-worn flannel. Her dress was still on her body, though torn and mended crudely along the seams. Her hair had been brushed back, tucked behind her ears. The skin of her legs prickled with ointment, thick and slightly sticky. Someone had treated her wounds. A man's voice did not greet her. No footsteps approached. That silence was the only mercy. Carefully, painfully. Tyann sat up. The movement made her gasp. Pain flared through her side. Her vision swam, but she pressed through it, teeth clenched. The blanket slipped down. Her dress gaped slightly at the collar, where the stitching had split, revealing a bruise the shape of a boot sole across her shoulder. A low cough caught her ear. Across the room, beside the fire, a man sat in a chair broad-shouldered, hat resting on his knee, arms folded over his chest. He didn't rise. He didn't speak, just watched. He had a beard streaked with gray, and the look of someone who had learned to live without speaking, unless it mattered. His coat hung from a nail by the door, frayed at the sleeves. One boot tapped absently against the wood floor, slow and even. Tyann's breath hitched. Her first instinct was to run, her second was to hide. But her legs trembled when she moved them from under the blanket, feet bare, toes curling against the cold floor. She gripped the edge of the bed to steady herself. The man didn't reach for her. He didn't rise to stop her. She stood, or tried to. Her knees gave way halfway up, and the world tilted sideways. Her hand reached blindly, found only air. She was falling, but then strong hands caught her under the arms, firm but not rough. He steadied her without speaking, then stepped back. Tayan leaned against the bed frame, chest heaving. Her pride flared hotter than the pain. She didn't look at him, but she could feel the steadiness of his gaze. Not hungry, not cruel, just present. He finally spoke, voice low and worn like weathered leather. "You've been here 2 days." That was all. No questions, no explanations. 2 days. The words echoed in her head. 2 days since the storm. 2 days since she gave herself up to death and found, instead, this strange pause between lives. She dared a glance toward the stove. A pot sat there, steam rising slow. The smell was rich with herbs and marrow, simple, nourishing. Her stomach ached with the thought of food. She hated that it did. Her lips were dry. She spoke without meaning to. Why he didn't answer. Just reached for a mug, filled it from a kettle, and set it on the table beside the bed. His hand stayed there a moment, then withdrew. Tayan sat back down, knees too weak to argue. She picked up the mug with both hands. It was warm. She drank, not because she trusted, but because her body demanded it. She drank slow, the liquid coating her throat, loosening something tight inside. He sat again, the chair creaking beneath him. No questions, no pressure, that silence. It unsettled her more than shouting would have. Outside, wind stirred the eaves. Snow whispered against the glass. Time stretched thin. Her fingers tightened around the cup. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't want to know. Not yet. Naming things made them real, but deep down, something flickered, a sliver of confusion, a reluctant sense of safety, and a question she couldn't voice. What now? She set the cup down, tried again to stand. Her legs shook, but held. She took a step toward the door, another. Her breath rasped through her teeth. A hand brushed the wall for balance. Behind her, the man didn't move, just watched. She reached the door, her fingers curling around the handle. Her body wasn't ready, but her will tried anyway. Her vision narrowed, and then darkness nipped at the corners of her sight. Her legs folded. Once again, she fell. But this time, before she hit the ground, 2 arms caught her and held her still. He hadn't spoken more than a sentence in 3 years. But somehow, her silence didn't feel empty. Elias Boone had lived with silence long enough to know its many shapes. There was the silence of an empty house, where floorboards never creaked unless you moved. The kind where wind slipped through the cracks in the shutters and carried only the sound of your own breath in return. There was the silence of memory, of letters unread and names unspoken. And then there was the kind he now sat in, the kind that shared space with another beating heart. She hadn't said another word since she asked why, and Elias hadn't offered one since. But he moved around her like a man with quiet purpose, not to impress, not to soothe, simply because the fire needed tending, and the pot needed stirring, and the water bucket by the door was always half empty this time of year. Routine filled the corners of his life, and he let her settle in without asking her to. The woman Tayan, though he didn't yet know her name, stayed mostly still that second day. Her body was not yet ready for much more. She tried to sit up, managed it with grit and little grace, and kept the blanket pulled tightly around her like armor. Her eyes tracked him, sharp and unblinking, like a wounded fox watching the hand that might feed or strike. Elias didn't touch her again, not even when he helped her back into bed after her faint the night before. He had laid her down gently, without pressure, and stepped away before her eyes fluttered fully open again. The space between them became its own kind of conversation. He set a bowl of soup on the table near the bed that afternoon, then stepped back and stirred the fire. He didn't look at her, but he could feel the weight of her gaze, cautious and measuring. She didn't move toward the food. Not at first. Only when he left the room and stepped onto the porch just for a few minutes to split wood did she shift. Through the window, he caught a glimpse. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the spoon. She held it in both hands like it was something sacred or dangerous. When he stepped back inside, the bowl was half empty. Her eyes met his, then flicked away. Still no words. But something in her shoulders had lowered, just a notch, by nightfall. A rhythm had taken hold, one not born of comfort, but of necessity. He moved through the cabin like it was habit, checked the stove, dried his coat, refilled her water, no instructions, no explanations. She didn't ask for any, she didn't speak, but neither did she flinch each time he passed close. That alone was progress. He noticed the small things, how her fingers tugged lightly at a thread on the quilt when she was thinking, how her left ankle, still bruised, shifted to the side when she tried to sit straighter, how her eyes lingered on the fire more often than on him. Elias didn't know her story, didn't need to. The bruises on her skin, the way her body curled into itself, the way she never let her back face the door, those told enough for now. Later, as he ladled soup into a fresh bowl, she surprised him. She reached for it. Her hand shook as she grasped the edge of the wooden bowl. Elias held it steady, and she took it with care, lips pressed tight. Her hand quivered as she tried to lift the spoon. The motion was slow, and her grip uneven. Then the spoon slipped. Broth spilled across her fingers. The bowl wobbled. She drew in a sharp breath of pain or frustration. He couldn't tell. Before she could pull away, Elias moved. One hand reached out, instinct more than thought. He caught the spoon, steadied the bowl, but he didn't touch her skin. He held the handle just long enough for her fingers to close around it again, then let go. Their eyes met. She expected something, pity, maybe, or a scolding word. But he said nothing, just stepped back, picked up a cloth from the counter, and handed it to her without looking. She wiped her hands. Her shoulders stiffened again, but when she returned the bowl to her lap, she didn't set it aside. She ate, slowly, carefully, and this time, when he returned to his chair by the fire, she didn't watch him with fear. She simply watched. Night drew in like ink. The wind outside shifted to a softer moan. Snow whispered across the roof, the storm having passed days before, but leaving its cold breath behind. The cabin held its heat well. The fire glowed low in the hearth, casting long shadows up the walls. Elias sat in his usual chair, the one with the worn cushion and cracked armrest. His hat hung on the peg near the door. His rifle rested beside him, not out of suspicion, just habit. Behind him, she lay still, but not asleep. He knew the feeling of being watched, not hunted, not threatened, just studied, like a man under quiet question. He didn't turn around, didn't speak, but her eyes stayed open, and the firelight drew his silhouette against the far wall, broad, steady, and still, while hers, smaller, flickered just beneath the covers, one arm bent beneath her head, her gaze tracing the curve of his back, the slow rise and fall of his breath. The silence was not heavy now. It held something else, not trust, but maybe the start of something less fragile than fear. Sometimes, the loudest moments are the ones where nothing is said at all. The days that followed did not unfold with grand gestures or sudden clarity. They came slowly, like thawing ground in spring, quiet, unnoticed, and absolutely necessary. Tyan began to walk more steadily. Each morning, she sat up with a little less effort, her limbs still tender but no longer trembling. She said nothing when Elias moved about the cabin, just watched, measured, and more matched his rhythm. By the end of the third morning, she was at the wash basin before he could offer help. She moved with the kind of determination born not from strength, but from pride. She didn't want pity, didn't want permission. She wanted to reclaim something. He let her. He didn't ask what she needed. Instead, he laid a clean towel beside the basin, filled the kettle, and stoked the stove to make sure the room stayed warm. When he finished, he stepped aside, giving her space. And when she took the towel in hand, pressing it to her face with eyes closed, he didn't look away, not out of disrespect, but recognition. People who had survived didn't need words. They needed stillness to find themselves again. That afternoon, she sat by the fire, a bowl of dried beans in her lap. Elias had left them for her on the table without a word, and she took it as an invitation, slowly, carefully. She began sorting them, removing the cracked ones, discarding the shriveled. He chopped wood out back. She could hear each strike echo through the crisp air, rhythmic, clean, like a heartbeat. Later, when she reached for kindling and nearly burned her fingers, he set a pair of thick gloves on the hearth beside her. Still, he said nothing, and she didn't thank him. But when she slipped her hands into them, her shoulders eased for the first time. By the fifth morning, a pair of old boots sat by the fire. They were scuffed at the toe, soles worn thin, one lace frayed near the top. But they had been cleaned, brushed, and oiled, clearly pulled from storage. Her own moccasins were still drying near the stove, damaged beyond repair from the snow. The boots weren't sized for her feet, not exactly, but they would do. Tyann looked at them for a long while before touching them. She didn't ask where they came from. She didn't ask why. Instead, she sat down, slipped them on, and tightened the laces with slow, deliberate care. When she stood, they held her weight just fine. Elias noticed, but said nothing. That night, she stirred the pot over the stove while he sharpened a knife at the table. It was a slow, even sound, the metal scraping lightly over whetstone, steady as breath. The scent of onions and salt pork hung in the air, simple and grounding. Tyann ladled soup into 2 bowls, set one near his hand, then returned to her spot near the fire. They ate together in silence, but not the kind that demanded filling. It was the kind that said, "This is enough." The next day, while Elias was out checking the line traps beyond the ridge, Tyann moved through the cabin alone for the first time. She didn't snoop. She wasn't looking for anything. But when she opened the cabinet to replace the tin cups, her fingers brushed the edge of a small wooden box tucked at the back of the shelf. It wasn't locked. Inside was a child's bracelet beads, faded but carefully strung, the leather worn smooth with time, Apache in style. Her breath caught. She picked it up gently, cradling it in her palm. It was too small for her wrist, too delicate to belong to anyone but a child. For a moment, her mind raced. Was it from someone he loved? A girl, a woman. But then she saw it. Folded beneath the bracelet, in the bottom of the box, was a small yellowed envelope. Inside, a drawing, done in pencil, faint with age, a boy's handwriting on the back. To Pa. She didn't need to see more. She replaced the bracelet with the same care she had lifted it, closed the lid, set it back where it had been. She stood still for a long time afterward, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the cabinet. Elias returned not long after, snow crusting the rim of his hat, gloves dark with cold. Tyann was at the table, slicing potatoes into a pan. She didn't look at him, but when he stepped behind her to hang his coat, she didn't stiffen. Not this time. That evening, when the fire settled low and the stew simmered slow, their shadows danced again along the cabin walls. The air smelled of thyme and cedar, and somewhere beneath it, something even fainter trust, not yet spoken aloud. Elias leaned back in his chair, long legs stretched before him, cup of coffee cooling in his hands. Tyann sat across the room, her feet tucked under her in those borrowed boots, mending a seam with clumsy, stubborn hands. She looked up once and caught him watching. She didn't look away, but her eyes held something different now. Not fear, not suspicion, something quieter, something seeing. And then, slowly, she returned to her stitching, the thread pulling through cloth in a steady rhythm. The bracelet never came up. The name of the boy was never said. But from that moment on, something had shifted. They were no longer strangers, merely sharing space. They were 2 people carrying ghosts, acknowledging, without speaking, that the cabin had room for more than one kind of silence. It only took one pair of eyes to turn a quiet life into town gossip. The man who saw her wasn't anyone important, just Emery Hayes, the postwriter from Dry Gulch. He'd been coming through these parts for years, never more than once a week, riding low in the saddle with his hat too big and his mouth quicker than his common sense. He was halfway through chewing a piece of jerky when he caught a glimpse of her on the ridge above the creek's light figure, dark hair pulled back, the hem of a patched dress catching wind as she gathered kindling. He slowed his horse, watched too long, then rode off faster than he came. That was all it took. By the next morning, back in town, words were already curling like smoke through the cracks in the saloon and general store. Old Boone's got himself company, someone muttered over whiskey. Not just company, Apache, they said. Lord help him, he's lost what little mind he had left. Dry Gulch was not a place that forgave quietly. It held on to suspicion like winter held on to ice. A woman on Boone's land, and one not of their own, that was enough to stir every bitter tongue. Ezra Maddox, the shopkeeper, shook his head when he heard. "Ain't my business what a man does out in the woods," he said aloud. But the tight set of his jaw said otherwise. He'd never liked Boone, said he kept too much to himself, said quiet men were either hiding something or had nothing left worth saying. Tyann didn't know any of this. Not yet. She went about her days at the cabin as she had begun to do slow, deliberate movements. She cleaned the pots, swept the floor with a stiff old broom, stepped outside only when the sun sat low and the wind had lost its bite. Elias kept their routine steady. He didn't mention the rider. He didn't say a word about town. But he sharpened his knife longer that night, and his gaze stayed longer on the horizon. 3 days later, a folded note arrived at the saloon. No envelope, no name, just a scrawled message in rough ink. That old fool's sheltering an Apache. Needs reminding where his place is. It was left under a glass by the bar. Sam Riggs read it first, one of Elias's old hunting companions. He didn't speak, just read it twice, folded it again, and slid it into his coat. He didn't agree with the tone, but he knew the town. Whispers like that had a way of growing teeth. By the end of the day, 4 men had heard the words. By nightfall, the number doubled. Some laughed, some shook their heads. A few just narrowed their eyes. Elias knew before the letter reached him. He could feel it in the air, the kind of cold that didn't come from weather. The following morning, he rode down the trail to the small post station near the river, a half-day's ride in fair weather. There, he found the note waiting, folded, unsmudged, heavy with intent. He read it once, no anger crossed his face, just a long, drawn breath. His shoulders didn't stiffen, his hands didn't shake, but something in his eyes dimmed, not with fear, just weariness. The old kind, the kind that came not from being surprised, but from being reminded of a truth he already knew. That out here, a man could live quiet for a decade and still be dragged back by a whisper. He slipped the note into his pocket, turned his horse without a word, and began the slow ride toward town. The snow along the trail had melted into patches, revealing mud and old tracks. Birds skirted the trees above, their cries sharp and distant. Elias rode straight-backed, reins loose in one hand, the other resting idly on his thigh. He wasn't planning a fight, but he wasn't riding away from one, either. Back at the cabin, Tyann stood by the fire, stirring beans in a tin pot. She didn't notice right away that Elias hadn't come in. The sky was already dimming. She reached for the matches, lit the second lantern, and paused. Something in the air felt different. Still. Too still. She looked toward the window, the trees beyond fading into evening blue. The ridge was quiet. His coat still hung on the nail. She waited, and in that waiting, her fingers closed tighter around the wooden spoon. She didn't know what had changed, but something had, and far down the trail, as Elias Boone rode alone into the shadow of Dry Gulch. The firelight from his cabin flickered behind him, unaware, but not unguarded. He had kept law once. Now he just wanted peace. But peace doesn't come free. Dry Gulch had always been small. One saloon, one general store, a post office no bigger than a root cellar, and a half-dozen homes with porches that leaned just slightly off level. The town sat where the road dipped low between 2 hills, tucked into the cottonwoods like it was hiding from its own history. But secrets didn't stay buried long here, and silence, however long it lasted, eventually echoed. Elias Boone hadn't ridden into town in over 2 months. He did it now, with the same quiet posture he always carried, shoulders squared, hat low, boots coated in dust. His horse moved slow, hooves striking packed earth with the soft thud of something that had been here before and would come again. He didn't look side to side, but he saw it all. The stillness of men pausing mid-conversation, the slow rise of narrowed eyes, the glance that lingered too long, then turned away too fast. He tied his horse at the post outside the general store. Inside, it smelled of kerosene, ground coffee, and old wood. Ezra Maddox stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled, wiping a jar that didn't need cleaning. He looked up when Elias entered, and his jaw tightened just enough to betray whatever friendly words he was about to say. "Boone," he offered, voice clipped. "Ezra." Elias nodded, stepping to the far shelves. He moved with the kind of calm that made people uncomfortable, unhurried, unbothered, but never quite unaware. He gathered flour, salt, a tin of coffee, a few boxes of rifle shells. Behind him, the murmurs started low. From the 2 ranchers near the pickle barrel, from the boy sweeping sawdust by the stove, from Sam Riggs, his old hunting partner, who stood by the window with arms crossed, watching like a man waiting for something to go wrong, Elias brought his goods to the counter. Ezra's hand hovered near the scale, then dropped. "You sure you need this much?" Ezra asked, not a real question, more like a spark. Elias looked him full in the face, calm, steady. "I know what I need." Ezra hesitated, then began weighing the goods, his motions sharper than usual. Silence fell again, but it wasn't empty. It pulsed. When Elias placed coins on the counter, a voice spoke behind him. "So it's true." Then, he didn't turn, just waited. Sam stepped forward, slower than most. His hat was in his hand. His eyes didn't carry hatred, but they didn't hold comfort either. "She's with you, the woman." Elias breathed in through his nose, let it out slow. "She's under my roof. That's all anyone needs to know." Another voice, more bitter, followed. "And what else happens under that roof?" The room shifted. Elias turned, finally, not fast, not loud, just enough that everyone in the room saw the way he straightened his back, the way his right hand rested near his belt, not on the Colt holstered there, but close enough that the air changed. "She stays under my roof," he said, each word firm. "She eats what I eat. She sleeps where it's warm. Anyone got a problem with that?" His eyes scanned the room. 1 heartbeat, 2. "You come say it to my face." No one moved, not Sam, not Ezra, not the boy near the stove. Elias didn't expect applause, didn't expect understanding. He only expected silence. And he got it. He picked up the sack of goods, adjusted the weight on his shoulder, and walked out without another word. Behind him, the door shut soft. No slamming, just final. The ride back was quieter than the town. Clouds gathered on the ridge, dark and wide. The air held the smell of weather not yet arrived ozone, dust, and that strange stillness before thunder makes its name known. Elias rode with the grain sack tied behind him, the wind teasing the brim of his hat, the sun slipping fast behind the trees. He didn't rush. He'd said what needed saying. The rest, he knew, would come whether he invited it or not. At the edge of the clearing, the cabin came into view, its roof catching the last of the light, chimney breathing slow smoke into the cooling air. Tyan stood outside. She wasn't doing anything, just watching. Her arms folded beneath the shawl she had stitched herself, her hair braided tight down her back. She wasn't looking at the clouds. She wasn't watching the trees. She was watching him. As he came closer, her eyes didn't soften, but they steadied. And as he dismounted, setting the sack down on the porch, he met her gaze not as a man returning from battle, but as one who had simply done what was right. Her voice didn't rise to greet him, but she stepped aside to let him through the door. And inside, the fire waited. A patch coat, a warm fire, and two people learning to stay, the tear in his coat wasn't fresh. It had been there since the tail end of autumn, caught on a nail near the fence post while Elias was mending wire. He hadn't bothered to fix it. The wind cut through the shoulder now, but he didn't mind. Cold was something you carried like old grief. You got used to it. Tyann noticed the tear the evening he came back from town. He'd hung the coat, same as always, on the nail by the stove. She'd said nothing. But later, when the light was low and Elias stepped outside to check the traps near the stream, she stood before the coat with a needle and thread. She worked slowly. Not because she didn't know how, but because the cloth was thick, and her fingers weren't as steady as they used to be. Still, she moved with intention, each stitch a small, quiet offering. She didn't owe him anything, but the thread didn't ask for debt. It asked for care. When Elias returned, he didn't mention the repair, just took the coat down, turned it in his hands once, then slipped it on like nothing had changed. The shoulder felt warmer. He said nothing. Tyann didn't expect thanks. But when she passed him a tin of coffee the next morning, he accepted it with a nod deeper than usual. Something wordless passed between them. The knife appeared the following day. It was small, bone-handled, finely balanced, not meant for hunting or defense, but for carving, trimming, craft. It sat on the corner of the stove where Tyann kept her basket of gathered pine needles and broken willow strips. No note, no explanation. She found it as she came in from outside, cheeks still pink from cold, arms full of bundled sage. Her hand paused above the blade, hovering. Then slowly, she picked it up, tested its weight, ran her thumb along the flat edge. It had been sharpened recently. She didn't look over at Elias, who sat cleaning his rifle at the table, but when she used it that afternoon to begin weaving a new basket, the tightness in her shoulders had less to do with fear and more to do with focus. They cooked together now, not every meal, but often enough. He knew how to season a stew without overpowering it. She taught him to dry roots for later use, how to braid the husks of corn into cords strong enough to hang herbs from the rafters. Their hands crossed often passing ladles, lifting lids, brushing spices into pans. They didn't speak, but their movements found rhythm. Tyann made a habit of watching him during these shared moments, not to study, but to understand. Elias had lived alone so long that he moved like a man shaped by silence. But there was grace in the way he poured water, in how he waited a beat longer before pulling bread from the stove, just to be sure. He wasn't just surviving anymore. And that realization struck her in ways she didn't expect. One night, as wind scraped lightly against the window panes, Tyann sat by the fire, a small half-finished basket in her lap. Elias sat near the door, cleaning his boots, the old rag dark with polish and time. They hadn't spoken all day, but the silence was warm. Then, as if pulled by something deep and unseen, Tyann's voice cut through the hush. "I haven't had a home since I was 16. The words came soft, as if she were testing their weight aloud for the first time. Elias looked up. She didn't meet his eyes. She ran her finger along the rim of the basket, her voice steady now. "My father was taken. My mother died of fever the winter after. The rest scattered. Some made it out. I didn't. No tears, no tremble, just truth." She stopped there. No names, no details, just that small corner of a story. Elias didn't press. He just nodded once and returned to his boots. That was all the answer she needed. Later that night, long after the fire had settled to a quiet glow, Elias sat in the old rocking chair near the door, rifle across his knees, one eye always trained on the dark beyond the window. The air inside the cabin was thick with cedar and ember. He glanced over once, expecting to see her curled on the bedroll she had been using near the back wall. But she wasn't there. Instead, she'd fallen asleep in the worn armchair near the hearth. Her shawl had slipped from one shoulder. Her head rested against the side of the chair, hair loosened from its braid, breath slow and even. The basket lay in her lap, forgotten. Elias watched her for a moment. She didn't stir, didn't tense. She looked, if only for now, like someone who had found enough peace to let go. And that, more than anything she'd said, told him everything he needed to know. The air had weight, not from weather, but from choices yet to be made. It began with a second letter, shorter than the first, uglier, scrawled in blocky, angry ink on torn paper. Shoved under a loose board at the trail post, Elias checked every other week. You keep her there. We'll come get her ourselves. No name, no return mark, just the threat, rough and sour, like the kind of rot that starts small but spreads fast. Elias folded it once, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, and stood there for a while without moving. He listened to the trees, to the hush of the breeze, to the world that, for a time, had gone quiet around him. But the silence now was no longer friendly. It held teeth. He didn't show Tyann the letter, didn't say a word about it that night as they sat beside the fire. She worked on a basket, slower now that her shoulders were sore from chopping wood earlier. He ran a whetstone over the blade of his skinning knife, not because it needed it, but because motion helped when words wouldn't come. Still, she knew something had changed. She saw it in the way he paused before hanging his coat, how he checked the latch on the door twice before settling in. She didn't ask, just watched. Some questions don't need answers to carry weight. The next morning, before he was fully awake, she had already stepped outside. It was early, frost still clinging to the grass like a second skin. The sun hadn't broken past the hills yet, but Tyann stood in the clearing, rope in hand, eyes trained on the gelding near the post. Elias, still at the window, didn't move. He watched her approach the horse with slow, deliberate steps. Her boots still too big for her feet sank into the cold mud, but she didn't falter. She held the rope like someone who had something to prove. Not to him, not even to the town, to herself. The horse tossed its head. Unfamiliar hands always made it wary. Tyann waited, reached, stepped back when it snorted, then tried again. Elias stepped out, slow, didn't say a word. He stopped a few feet away, the leather of his gloves soft as he crossed his arms. The morning light made his breath visible in short puffs. He watched her fumble the rope once, then again. Her jaw clenched, her brow furrowed. The third try, she made the loop, not clean, not fast, but steady. She moved to tighten it. The horse stepped back, and Elias, without thinking, reached to steady the line. Their hands met at the same moment, rope beneath both palms, and neither moved. Her fingers were cold. His were scarred and rough. She didn't pull away, not like before. She didn't drop her gaze either. Her eyes, sharp as a canyon wind, met his no longer filled with fear, but with something harder, something steadier. He didn't say anything, just slowly let go and stepped aside. She held the line and finished the knot. That evening, they worked side by side without comment. He chopped the last of the winter wood. She packed dried herbs into jars, labeled them in small, faded script. He cooked while she added pinches of salt and cornmeal. They shared space without stepping over one another. And when the kettle whistled, she poured the tea before he could reach for it. They still didn't talk much, but the space between silences had changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. It felt like breath. Later that night, after the bowls had been cleaned and the shutters latched, Elias stepped out for his usual watch. He didn't take the rifle, just his lantern and the comfort of old habits. The air was sharp, still. The moon hung low, thick and yellow behind the tree line. He didn't expect visitors, but something in his gut had begun to prepare anyway. The land was quiet, but not at rest. He walked the edge of the clearing once, twice, then turned back toward the house. Inside, the fire had died down to soft embers, casting a low orange glow across the wood floor. The cabin smelled of cedar and ash. A single lantern flickered on the table, and then he saw it, his shirt, folded, neatly, placed on the edge of his bed. It wasn't just any shirt, it was the thick flannel one he used to wear in the fall, before the shoulders began to give way. He hadn't worn it in years, but he hadn't let it go either. Tyann had found it at some point, mended the seams, washed it, dried it near the fire. Now it sat waiting, quiet and simple. And she She was across the room, not pretending to sleep, just sitting near the hearth, arms around her knees, the flicker of firelight reflected in her eyes. She didn't look at him when he entered. She didn't need to. He looked at the shirt again, touched it once, then placed it gently beside the pillow. When he finally sat down, his shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but he knew it was coming, and for once, he didn't feel alone in waiting for it. She had been touched only to be taken. Tonight. She reached to stay. The cold came with silence. Not the brutal kind that howls through broken windows or hisses beneath door frames, but the kind that sinks in, slow. That takes its time creeping beneath sleeves and inside bones. Outside. The snow hadn't yet started, but the air carried the promise of it like breath before a confession. Inside, the fire was steady. It crackled gently, casting long shadows on the cabin walls. The two chairs near the hearth had grown familiar now hers. Closer to the fire, his, angled slightly toward the door, as if half listening for the world outside. Tayan sat in hers, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Her hair had come loose from its braid, soft wisps curling around her cheekbones. She wasn't shivering. Not anymore. The cold didn't own her like it once did, but she felt it, still, in the way her fingers curled around the tin cup of tea, holding on not just for warmth, but for grounding. Elias sat across from her, boot heels flat against the wooden floor, mug in hand, eyes distant. He looked as he always did, solid, unmoved. But something about the way his shoulders sloped tonight told a different story. He was tired, not of her, not of the world, but of the weight silence sometimes carried, even in peace. It had been a week since the second letter. He hadn't spoken of it, hadn't shown her the words etched in jagged ink, but something had shifted since. His hands lingered longer at the windowsill. His boots stayed near the door, always ready. He'd begun leaving the lantern lit longer into the night. Tayan had noticed, but she hadn't asked. Until tonight, her voice came quiet. "This is the first winter I've been warm." The words floated gently, as if testing the air before finding a place to land. Elias looked up. It was not a grand statement, not a plea, just a truth, spoken plainly, like she was stating a fact about the weather. But in her tone, there was something fragile, something waiting to be received. He said nothing, but he watched her, and after a moment, Tayan shifted. She set the cup down slowly, the metal clinking softly against the wood. Then, with fingers that trembled slightly not from cold, but from something deeper, she leaned forward. Her hand reached out, not far, just enough to cross the space between them and settle gently on the thick fabric of his shoulder. She didn't grip, didn't lean. She simply rested her hand there, as if saying without words, "I'm still here. I choose to be here." Elias stilled. The heat from the fire pulsed between them. The room seemed to hold its breath. Her touch didn't ask anything of him. It wasn't a reaching for safety, or approval, or shelter. It was something else entirely. A declaration, maybe, or the beginning of one. He didn't flinch. He didn't shift away. He let her hand rest there, firm and warm. And then, after a long moment, he spoke, not loudly, not with force, but with the quiet certainty of a man who'd buried too many words and was now willing to unearth one. "If this is your home," he said, voice low and steady, "stay as long as you want." There was no offer in it, no transaction, no expectation, just truth, given gently. Her eyes closed not in grief, but in something closer to relief. A breath she hadn't known she'd been holding eased out of her lungs. The fire popped. The snow outside began to tap softly against the window. She drew her hand back, not because she changed her mind, but because she was ready for the next part, and then deliberately. Slowly she placed her hand atop his where it rested on his leg. It was not a hesitant touch. It was the first full gesture. Her fingers slid lightly over the back of his weathered hand, calloused and warm. His skin twitched slightly under her touch, not in recoil, but in recognition. He didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his palm upward, and she left hers there. Their hands stayed joined, not clutched, not grasping but resting, meeting, the kind of touch that doesn't ask for more, that says, I see you, I'm here, outside. The snow began to fall in earnest. Inside, the firelight curled around their silhouettes, casting them in gold. Tayan's head leaned back against the chair. Her body softened, and for the first time since arriving, she did not look like a woman waiting for the next door to close. She looked like someone learning to stay. Elias sat beside her, eyes half-lidded, feeling the weight of her hand, the nearness of shared breath, and something he hadn't felt in years, a quiet he didn't want to break. Some battles are won not with bullets, but with presence. They didn't ride in fast. There was no dust cloud, no gallop to announce their arrival, like some dramatic tale from the dime novels folks like to whisper about. No, Elias Boone rode with the quiet steadiness of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. And Tayan, beside him, sat tall on her own horse, neither hidden by his shadow nor following behind. They came at noon, when the sun was high and judgment sharper. The hooves of their horses struck the packed dirt in even rhythm, echoing through the quiet street of Dry Gulch. It wasn't a loud town, but that afternoon, it might as well have been silent, as if the earth itself held its breath. People looked. First it was the old woman sweeping her porch, her broom pausing midair, then the butcher's apprentice, standing slack-jawed beside a crate of salted pork, and then, inevitably, the saloon. The door swung just enough for faces to press against the frame. Words didn't pass lips, but stares did. And those stares said, enough. Elias had brought her in, not in the early morning, not at night, but under the clearest, brightest light. Tayan didn't hide. She wore the shawl she'd mended herself. The sleeves of her blouse rolled to the elbows, her hands steady on the reins. Her hair shorter now, just brushing her jaw caught the sun like copper thread. She didn't look to the crowd, but she saw them. All of them. She had ridden into towns before, but never like this. Never beside someone who didn't just let her be seen, but insisted on it. They passed the sheriff's office. The windows were shuttered, but Elias's eyes flicked toward it, brief but purposeful. The sheriff had always preferred things quiet, even if that meant turning his head the other way. Elias wasn't here to ask for help. He was here to make things plain. They stopped in front of the general store. Elias dismounted first. He moved slowly, not with hesitation, but with care. A man used to weighing his presence like he would a weapon. Tayan slid from her saddle without assistance. She didn't need help, not anymore. He waited for her, then stepped forward, and together they entered the store. Ezra Maddox stood behind the counter. He didn't blink when he saw them. He just set down the ledger in his hand and folded his arms. The store was quiet, save for the soft creak of the door and the rustle of fabric near the back where a young girl, probably his niece, pretended to reorganize bolts of cloth while sneaking glances over her shoulder. Elias pulled a small, handwritten list from his pocket. Flour, salt, kerosene, thread, coffee. Ezra took the list, eyes scanning. He didn't move right away. Instead, his gaze settled on Tayan sharp, measuring. "She with you now?" he asked, not bothering to lower his voice. Elias didn't hesitate. "She eats what I eat, sleeps where I sleep." A pause. The whole store listened. Elias's voice didn't rise, but it filled the space like thunder before rain. "And no man lays a hand on her." Ezra's jaw worked for a moment, like he might say something else. But then he turned, pulled items from shelves with jerky, deliberate movements, and packed them into a canvas sack. No words, just obedience. When the order was filled and paid for, Elias turned to go. Tayan followed, and the bell above the door gave a small, tired chime as they stepped out into the sunlight again. This time, the town didn't bother hiding its stare. They walked past the barber's shop, where two men sat outside with unlit cigars clamped between their teeth. One of them stood when he saw her. The other grabbed his arm. "Let it go. She's with him." They passed the milliner's window, where bolts of blue gingham and muslin were arranged in hopeful curls. Tayan didn't stop, but her eyes lingered for a breath on the cloth, on the ordinary softness of it. The kind of fabric women chose for Sundays, or for new aprons when spring came. Elias noticed, didn't say a word, just kept walking beside her. Their boots thudded in unison, at the edge of town, just before they reached the horses. Tayan paused. She turned, not to hide, not to check who followed, but to look. The town lay behind her, sun-baked, small, and full of its own echoes. The stairs still pressed against her back, but they didn't weigh the same anymore. She stood taller. Her hands didn't tremble. Her breath didn't catch. And when the breeze picked up, brushing the short ends of her hair across her cheek, she reached up and tucked it back. A simple gesture, but powerful. It said, "I see you seeing me, and I don't care anymore." She mounted her horse without a word. Elias handed her the sack. She took it, balanced it behind her saddle, and looked once more at the road ahead. Not behind, not down, ahead. The sun caught her shoulders, and for the first time, the town of Dry Gulch saw not just a woman from somewhere else, but someone who had chosen to be here, and someone who had been chosen in return. She came to die, she stayed to live, and now she belongs. Spring came slow to the ridge above Dry Gulch, not in bursts of color or sudden warmth, but in quiet thaws, the kind you only noticed if you'd lived through enough winters to recognize the softness in the wind. The creek began to run again, not loud, not wild, but steady like breath returning to tired lungs. The frost pulled back from the soil one morning in April, and Tayan knelt beside the earth, bare hands pressing into the thawed dirt, planting seeds of cantaloupe and squash in careful rows. She moved with reverence, whispering a prayer she hadn't spoken in years, not in Apache, not in English, just in feeling, a prayer of presence, of staying. Behind her, Elias worked on the north fence, hammering new posts where the rot had gotten in. He didn't say much, as always, but the cadence of his work spoke for him. Each strike of the mallet into earth was an act of rebuilding, of claiming space, not with force, with care. No one came up the trail anymore, not with letters, not with warnings. The town had quieted. Oh, they still spoke. Elias knew that. Dry Gulch wasn't the kind of place to forget. But something had shifted after that ride into town. People didn't challenge what they couldn't stare down. And Elias Boone, with his quiet eyes and steady hands, wasn't a man to provoke twice. More than once, folks had seen Tayan alone near the river, collecting sage and mint, her shawl tucked into her belt as she bent low among the rocks. No one stopped her. No one turned her in. She wasn't a secret anymore, and Elias never apologized. They didn't need the town's permission to build a life. They only needed the space to do it. One afternoon, the wind carried the scent of warmed pine and damp grass through the open window. Tayan stood at the table, sorting dried herbs into jars, lavender, yarrow, slices of ginger she'd bartered from a peddler who passed through with spring. Elias came in quietly, set his gloves on the shelf, took off his hat. She turned, half smiling, brushing flour from her palms. He didn't say anything right away, just watched her a moment, then reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled something out. It was small, round, sanded smooth, a circle of pale wood, no larger than a thumbprint, carved with a simple design, two curved lines crossing like threads in a basket. The kind of thing someone made when they had time and a thought they didn't quite know how to say. He set it on the table between them. "If we ever have a child," he said quietly, "I want them to have something we made." Tayan stared at it, her breath caught not in fear, but in awe. She reached for the carving, turned it over in her palm. It was light, and it was whole. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she reached across the table and took his hand, held it, firm, long, the kind of hold that didn't ask for promises, that didn't chase futures, but said, "I'm here, still, entirely," and he understood. There was nothing more to add. That evening, the sky blushed soft pink as the sun slid behind the hills. Elias sat on the porch, carving another small shape, this one less precise, more playful. A rabbit, maybe, or a bear. The wood chipped under his knife, but he smiled through it. Tayan brought out 2 mugs of coffee and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The breeze was warm now, no longer sharp. The earth had softened, and so had they. The fences stood mended. The horses grazed quietly, and within the walls of the old cabin, a fire waited low and steady, like the kind that didn't chase the cold, but welcomed what came next. In Dry Gulch, the gossip faded, not because people forgot, but because peace, once settled, left little room for noise. Sam Riggs still nodded when he saw Elias in town. Ezra Maddox still avoided his gaze, but the girl from the cloth shop had sent Tayan a bundle of linen with no note, just neatly folded, tied with blue string, and Tayan had stitched curtains from it, pale, sun-washed curtains that moved like breath in the cabin windows. She didn't come to live, not at first. She came to disappear, to lie down beneath the weight of wind and snow and silence. But something in the steadiness of Elias Boone had changed that. Not with rescue, not with words, but with space, with firelight, with presence. And now, beneath a sky finally free of frost, with dirt beneath her fingernails and a hand in her own, Tayan knew she hadn't been saved. She'd been seen, and that was enough. In a world that often moves too fast and forgets too easily, this story reminds us of something simple but vital. Healing takes time, and sometimes, silence is enough. Tayan and Elias didn't fix each other. They didn't fall into romance with fireworks or grand gestures. Instead, they offered space, safety, small kindnesses repeated every day, a bowl of soup, a steady hand, a warm place to sleep, so often. We think love must be loud and healing must be quick, but for those who've carried grief, shame, or loss for too long, the most powerful gift isn't words, it's presence. This story speaks to anyone who's ever been alone too long or felt forgotten. It whispers, you still belong. You are not too late to begin again. Whether you're rebuilding after heartbreak or simply learning to stay soft in a hard world, remember, even the quietest fire can warm a home. Let this story be a gentle reminder you don't have to speak loudly to live fully. Thank you for spending your time with us and for walking this quiet journey through the Wild West. If this story touched your heart, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribing to Wild West Echoes for more stories that honor resilience, healing, and the quiet strength of the human spirit. Your support helps us keep these forgotten echoes alive. We'll see you in the next story.